You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. Today is May 4th, 2025, and this is episode 315 of Lighthearted. I'm going to get right into the introduction of today's interview with David Wright, the town historian of Stratford, Connecticut. Stratford was an active port and coastal trade, shipbuilding, and oystering in the 18th and 19th centuries. To mark the entrance to the harbor, the first Stratford Point Lighthouse was built on the west side of the dangerous mouth of the Housatonic River in 1822. The present cast-iron lighthouse tower, 35 feet tall, was built along with the new keeper's house in 1881. Theodore, or Theod, Judson was keeper from 1880 to 1921. In his more than 4 decades at Stratford Point, Judson frequently made the local newspapers with sightings of sea monsters and mermaids. The light station is still owned by the Coast Guard, but the town of Stratford holds occasional open houses for the public. Our guest today, David Wright, is the Stratford town historian. He gives walking tours and writes articles about local history. When the lighthouse is open, David takes on the identity of Keeper Theodore Judson, while his wife portrays the keeper's wife, Kate. Let's listen to my conversation with David Wright now. I am talking this morning with David Wright, who is the town historian in beautiful Stratford, Connecticut. Place that I've been to a number of times over the years. Haven't been in a while. Hope to get back. So thanks so much for joining me this morning, David. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So obviously the lighthouse is our big topic for today, but before we get to that, maybe just a little bit about your background. So what led you to become the historian for Stratford?
Well, it's a circuitous route for a historian because I had a strange route to that position. I was certified by the state of Connecticut many years ago as a naturalist, and one of my duties was to educate people on wildlife and historic, nature areas in the state of Connecticut. And about that time, shortly after that time, I was hired by the town of Stratford to be their information technology manager. And as I went to work for the town, the recreation department director at the time asked me, since I was what's known in Connecticut as a master wildlife conservationist, if I would mind conducting tours in the town. And while I knew just an awfully lot about natural history, what I didn't know much about was Stratford's history. And as I started providing walks to the people in town, they would ask me questions that had nothing to do with the natural history, but had everything to do with Stratford history. And I became a little anxious about the tours because I really couldn't answer those questions. And the town is almost 400 years old. In 2039, it'll be 400 years old. So I felt like there's been a lot of change here. I should know something about it. And one of the big things in town is a forest in the north end called Roosevelt Forest, which many people have never been to or heard about, but it had a very colorful history itself, very, very political in nature. And there were a number of things there related to Stratford's past, related to the Civil Defense Department, and also to a very large stone cairn that had been built there. And people would ask me about those things all the time, and I didn't have an answer. So I started doing my research originally about Roosevelt Forest, and one thing led to another. I did a series of about 14 nature walks every year, and I would try to research the different places that I took people to from a historical standpoint. Well, the mayor of Stratford in 2013 wanted to begin preparations for celebrating Stratford's 375th anniversary. And he asked me, as the IT manager, we recently created a new website, if I would put up a website for Stratford 375. And I said I would, and then he asked me if I would post something every day about Stratford history. So I created a Facebook page. I called it Stratford 375, and I would research everything. I spent an awfully lot of time at Stratford Historical Society. It really became my home away from home, and I was posting pictures, newspaper articles, just anything that could remind people of what Stratford's history had been over the past 375 years. Because one of the most amazing parts about this town, and are things that are just amazing, things have happened here that no one knows about. Stratford is probably Connecticut's best kept secret. And the people in town don't know its history either. So I took a lot of time doing that. Well, when I finished that up in 2014, after the 375th ended, the Stratford Historical Society asked me if I would begin writing their newsletter. And it was a bi-monthly newsletter, so I had to start doing even more research. And I was doing that. And about 2.5 years ago, the current mayor of Stratford then said to me, "Gee, you're doing an awfully lot of research about Stratford's history. We haven't had a town historian since the early 1990s. We need one. Would you like to perform that function for us?" And I said I would. I was doing it anyway, so it was not a hard thing to just continue on.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting combination, being having a background as a conservationist. You're sort of conserving history along with the natural world. Yeah.
That is correct. I've done an awfully lot of that. There is so much here that has never been written in a history book. We've had 3 official histories written of the town, and I understand whenever you write a book, you have to be selective about what you put in it when it comes to a history book. But unfortunately, that selectivity removed a lot of what I think are some of the more fascinating points of Stratford's history. Mm-hmm. And those seem to be the things that people really respond to. And some of that color, some of that interesting history is really tied up with the lighthouse itself.
Yeah. We'll get to that in a second. But you mentioned, of course, writing articles about the town history. But anything else you do as town historian besides writing about history and research?
I give people tours. I do a walking tour series every year. I do about 20 walks. I do a reenactment of the town's longest serving lighthouse keeper every year. At Stratford Point, we open up the lighthouse, and I reenact the role of Theodore Judson. It's a lot of fun, and people seem to enjoy that. I make presentations to the town council when they're looking for some historical background, and my position really includes supporting any of the departments or the people in town who need research done on Stratford's history. I support very actively the Stratford Historical Society as well.
Yeah, we'll get to Theodore Judson in a little while. Probably the most interesting personality in the history of Stratford Point Lighthouse. Let me ask you something about the name of the town of Stratford. I was in England a couple of years ago, and I got to visit Stratford upon Avon, and I got to go to Shakespeare's birthplace and see a play at the Shakespeare Theater there. Does the name of Stratford, Connecticut, have any connection to Stratford upon Avon in England?
The theory on that one, Jeremy, has evolved over time. And the reason is that the settlers that settled, there were 17 families that settled Stratford in 1639. Some of them came from Stratford-on-Avon. Some of them came from another Stratford in a different county in England. And at different points in Stratford's history, we've either made the claim that we were named after Stratford-upon-Avon, or we were named after one of the other Stratfords in England. When the famous Shakespeare Theater was built here in Stratford back in 1955, there was no argument anymore at that point. We were named after Stratford-upon-Avon, and we called the town for a period of time Stratford upon the Housatonic, because the Housatonic River runs just to the east of town. It's the eastern border of the town. So you can, you can probably pick either one. There were settlers from either town, but I think popularly in the town, they like to say they were named after Stratford upon Avon. Our last town historian, a man by the name of Lewis Knapp, started out with that, but by the time of his passing, he was no longer convinced that was actually the way the town got its name.
Well, you might as well run with it at this point. Yeah. I believe I have some writings by Lewis Knapp in my collection, my archive on Stratford.
Great man,
Yeah.
in many ways.
Uh-huh. So you mentioned articles on your Facebook page and all that, but there's also something called the Stratford Crier I was looking at, a website.
The Stratford Crier is an online newspaper uh, that's updated basically every week, and the editor of that paper, the owner of that online paper, is a man by the name of David Chess. He's a well-known doctor in the area. He's founded many different kinds of medical businesses, and he asked me some time ago if I wouldn't write articles about Stratford. He didn't really care what they were. He didn't mind. He knew my background in natural history. He said, if you want to write about that, that's fine. If you want to write about Stratford's history, that's fine. But anything that will give people a better understanding of Stratford, I'd like you to provide at least a monthly article in my online newspaper, which I've done. I usually do more than a monthly article just because there's so much to write about. And I've written so many articles, many of which I've repurposed for the Crier.
So obviously, as you just said, there's tons of interesting stories in the history of Stratford, and it's probably unfair to ask you this, but for the purposes of the podcast, could you just maybe tell listeners a couple of really interesting things that you think people would be interested to hear about Stratford?
Well, over 40 years before Salem, Massachusetts was hanging women for witchcraft, Connecticut was doing that. And one of the first women that was hanged for witchcraft was a woman who moved from Windsor, Connecticut to Stratford in about 1649. And she was subsequently accused. She'd been associated with the first witch that was hanged in Windsor in 1647. She was associated with her, and unfortunately, that association followed her to Stratford. And in 1651, she was tried and hanged. And we're one of two towns on the Connecticut coastline in which a woman was hanged, Goody Bassett in the town of Stratford and Goody Knapp in the town of Fairfield. Goody is not her name. It's a title. It's short for good wife, but we don't know what her first name was. We only know her as Goody Bassett. I think the second thing that's interesting is Stratford was the first town to celebrate Christmas in Connecticut. The Puritans did not celebrate any holidays. They thought Christmas was a pagan evil holiday. And so in 1724, the first pastor of the Episcopal Church, which was the first Episcopal church in the colony of Connecticut, a man by the name of Samuel Johnson, celebrated the very first Christmas in the state of Connecticut in December 24th of 1724. And then we have a couple of other things I think that are interesting. We had a tie into Paul Revere, a Stratford man by the name of Ebenezer Hurd in 1725 in April, after Paul Revere had made his ride. His declaration of what had happened in Massachusetts was passed on to the post riders, and the post riders were the men who delivered the mail along a route. Ebenezer Hurd's route started in Saybrook, Connecticut, and continued to New York City. It was about a 137-mile ride. And the day after Paul Revere made his ride, the information was handed down, came to Saybrook. He rode with that to New York. and let the people in New York City know what was going on. And probably one of my most favorite stories is Stratford, to the best of my knowledge, was the only town in the state of Connecticut that men supported and promoted the idea of women's suffrage.
Hmm.
So we had a very active group of men here that worked very hard through the early 1900s to ensure that the women in town got the vote. We also had some of the most amazing women involved in that process. And lastly, the first flight, which has been denied by the Smithsonian and originally by Orville Wright, but we know it's true. It's been well documented. The first and longest sustained airplane flight happened from Stratford Beach in 1901. In August of 1901, a man by the name of Gustav Whitehead made that flight. So all of those things, I think, are unique to Stratford, and most people have no idea that any of that happened.
Yeah, well, that's quite a history, and I'm sure you could go on. But if you haven't considered it, you might want to consider a podcast on the history of Stratford, where you could tell a story each for each episode. I'd like to hear it.
I've done some of that in the
Oh, you
past.
have? Okay, you're way ahead of me. Good. So moving on to the lighthouse. First of all, the lighthouse is in a part of Stratford called Lordship. I've always wondered where that name came from.
The name came from a lord. We're not sure which one. There was a famous smuggler, and his title was Lord. He used to store his rum and his slaves right next to where the lighthouse is today in underground tunnels.
Huh.
And some people believe as a result of that, his name, the title of his name, Lord, stuck. But it was definitely named after an English lord. We just don't have a confirmation on which one.
Okay, another interesting bit of history there. The lighthouse itself, the first light at Stratford Point was established more than 200 years ago in 1822. So, why was a lighthouse needed at that time?
The sea captains, particularly those coming from New York City, had long declared that Stratford Point was the most dangerous point in Long Island Sound. We have enormous boulders that go far out into the Sound. And of course, as the tide goes out, those boulders are exposed, and there were many, many ships that foundered on the rocks at Stratford Point. And and there's a fable associated with it too about how the lighthouse came to be. But anyway, in 1800, as a result of that, they began to put a basket with at first coals and then later on lard and then whale oil to let people be able to see that Stratford Point was coming up. And the sea captains, as they'd see that, would try and stay as far out in the middle of the Sound as they could away from Stratford Point because they knew it was very dangerous. Well, by 1821, the lightship, the lighthouse service in Washington, decided to make Stratford Point the location of the third lighthouse on Long Island Sound. And so they built the first lighthouse there. It's not the one that stands today. That one was torn down in 1880. But that's really why the lighthouse came about. It was largely a result of the sea captains being terrified as they would sail by Stratford Point in bad weather. And the fable says that on New Year's Eve of 1799, there were a group of partiers from Manhattan that wanted to go to Boston for New Year's Day to party. And as they were coming toward the Stratford Point, the captain couldn't see the shoreline. He knew about where he was by the number of hours that he'd been sailing. And he grew very worried because he knew that he could easily founder. He had 100 revelers on board, and he was afraid of foundering and having them all die. There was nobody to help him if that happened. So he apparently expressed his fear to the revelers on board. And just as everyone was very afraid, a finger of light lit the Stratford Point shoreline. He was able to avoid all the rocks, made it to Boston. And the people on board, when they got to Boston, decided they would put that basket of coals on the point so that no other group of travelers would ever have to experience the fear they had experienced as they were sailing by Stratford Point on New Year's Eve, 1799.
Wow. And the first, refresh my memory, was the first lighthouse a stone tower?
No, it was wood,
It was
actually.
wood.
And
Okay.
it was wood and it was painted red and white vertically. So the stripes went vertically. It was only about 22 feet tall, but
Hmm.
it was a wooden structure and it
Yeah.
had become very run down by 1871. The lighthouse service declared that it really wasn't serviceable anymore and they wanted a new lighthouse. And so it only took them 10 years to build the new one, but they
Sounds
eventually
about right.
got to.
Yeah, it's the wheels of federal government for you. But so the new tower that stands today, of course, is cast iron. It has that red stripe in the center of the tower instead of a vertical stripe. But it's a
Correct.
more familiar lighthouse, I think, to people. They built a lighthouse board, built a lot of lighthouses similar to that around New England.
This
18.
one looks exactly like the one in Maine, in York, Maine. It's
Double.
the exact replica of that one, which was built the year earlier, and the keeper's cottage looks exactly the same. So when you
Yeah.
go to York, you could that one's on a little bit of an island off York, but it's identical.
Yeah, the house, as you said, also the nubble's a little different in the sense that there's a covered walkway between the house and tower, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. So I believe there were some women that figured pretty prominently in the early history of Stratford Point Lighthouse. Well, not the early history, but throughout the history, I think. But
Well, the two big ones that we think about are a young girl named Lottie Lillingston, who in about 1870, her father and the other folks that had been at the lighthouse with him left and left her with her grandmother because her grandmother was ill. That night, there was a very bad storm. It knocked out the light. Lottie knew that with the storm, the sea captains would need to be able to see where Stratford Point was. So she ran to the top of the lighthouse, at the old lighthouse, and held a lantern there all night to let the sea captains know where Stratford Point was. And she became quite a little heroine. Her story was heralded pretty much far and wide for what she'd done. And in 1897, Theodore Judson's daughter, Agnes, saw two boys from Bridgeport. They were in a small boat and it broke up on the rocks of Stratford Point. So her father and brother were on Stratford Point, but nowhere near. So she ran to assist them, putting herself at great peril to get there. And she was shouting at her brother, but really by the time he got there, she'd already rescued them. And the story of Agnes's rescue went viral in the papers of America at that time, and pretty much every single newspaper carried an article. Probably the most famous one was published in the Bridgeport Herald, and they did a real nice job of. She wouldn't take credit for it. She didn't want to be praised. They offered her an award. They wanted to recognize her in some way, but she said, "No, I was just doing what anybody would have done in my situation." So those are the two women I know about. Theodore's wife was also a character, but she didn't rescue anyone that I know of.
yeah, that rescue, what she said there, reminds me so much of the famous Ida Lewis in Newport, Rhode Island, who rescued at least 18 people from drowning while she was keeper, and she would say the same thing. It's just what anybody would do. I don't, I don't think so, but they were so modest about what they did. So you mentioned Theodore Judson. You just mentioned him again. Probably the most, I would say, the most colorful character in the history of Stratford Point Light Station. He was keeper for more than 40 years, I believe. Well, that in itself is pretty unusual to be a keeper at one place for so long. So he was known, often he was referred to as Theod Judson, I believe, but he also had the nickname Crazy Judson. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Theodore, despite what people thought, well, there were a couple of lines of thought even back then. The interior of the lighthouse is coated with lead, and it gives off an emission that, of course, lead gives off. And there were people in town that thought he'd spent too much time inside the lighthouse, and maybe that had affected him. He was also hit by lightning. And there were other people in town that thought maybe it was the lightning that did it. But the one thing I've come to know about Theodore is he was no less a showman than P.T. Barnum was.
Yeah.
And he loved the attention. He was lonely. I mean, there was only one little tiny bridge to get out to Stratford Point. The only real way to get there year round was in a boat. I'm sure he was just very lonely. So one of the first things he did to get people to visit him was he knew they weren't going to go anywhere, so he turned birds and small game loose on Stratford Point so men would come out from town to shoot. And eventually, because of that, a gun club was put in just to the east of the lighthouse, and it was there for many, many years. It was originally known as the originally known as the Housatonic Gun Club, and then Remington purchased it just after World War II. And it hasn't operated since about 1983, but it was very well known. But Theodore wanted people there. He told a story about a sea monster that had gone past Stratford Point. The origin of that sea monster was Hartford, Connecticut, in the Connecticut River in 1880, and it made its way down in Hartford. It started out as about a 12-foot sea monster. By the time it got to Stratford, Theodore said it was 150 feet long, and it had the size of a locomotive engine. His daughter and many other men, prominent men in town, agreed that sea monster existed. And to me, largely what Theodore was doing was just getting attention from the people in town, and the newspaper reporters would flock to Bridgeport because he had so many good stories. He claimed that his chickens were attacked by a 12-foot sea monster that came up into his chicken coop and ate some of his chickens at night. He shot it with a shotgun, and he put it on display in the hardware store, the Tar hardware store in the middle of town. For quite a while it was there. And then his most famous story was about the mermaids that visited him all the time. He put out hairbrushes, hair combs, mirrors. So he knew the mermaids were very vain. And so he knew they liked to comb their hair. So he put out appropriate instruments for them to groom themselves. And that story was told several times in the local Bridgeport newspaper. He was very popular in town. People loved Theodore. In 1916, the lighthouse service decided they were going to replace him with his assistant, a man by the name of William Petzold. And when word of that got out to the people in town, they had an absolute fit. The sea captains had a fit. And they wrote letters to Washington saying, "You absolutely cannot transfer Theodore." So they left him there. And eventually his assistant, an assistant he'd had earlier than Petzold, was transferred to Newport because he was so hard to get along with. After he retired officially in 1921, he moved up to the center of town, and he was a regular figure in Stratford at the firehouse, which is, well, originally was right in the center of town, and people would go there to visit him. He was known as the weather forecaster, and if you ever wanted to know about the weather, Theodore would be more than happy to share that with you. So yeah, he was known as Crazy Theodore, Crazy Theed, Crazy Theen, but I think really he was just a lonely guy who needed some attention.
I totally agree with you. I've written about him in the past. I wrote a book on Connecticut lighthouses and did some research on him, but you just told me some things I didn't know. It's really interesting. I think you could write a book just about him or make a movie about him or something like that. But what a character. I didn't know about being hit by lightning. That's really
Yeah, he
yeah.
was, or
Yeah.
at least he claims he was. I mean, I can't
Right, there you go. There you go.
I can't certify
Yeah.
that, but the people in town thought he'd been hit by lightning.
Yeah, yeah. The giant sea monster. I knew about that, but I didn't know about the smaller one that he said ate his chickens. So
Yeah, it was a much smaller monster.
Yeah.
It actually was a large fish. It had a name. I forget the name, but it wasn't a surprise much to people in town. They were just surprised that it would crawl across the beach up into his hen house to
Yeah.
steal his chicken.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, there was, you mentioned P.T. Barnum. I believe at one point, well, I think Barnum had already died by that time, but earlier he
Yes.
had offered a reward for, it wasn't just for the sighting of a sea monster, but for somebody to actually catch one.
Well, what he'd actually offered the reward for was the capture of a mermaid. And Theodore claimed in 1915, many, many years after Barnum had died, that he had actually grabbed one of the mermaids
Right.
and she had struggled to get away from him, but she'd left behind a couple of things. One of them was a lot of scales on his clothing, and the other one was a brooch. And one of my favorite stories is to tell that because his wife, as people would accuse him of not being truthful, would show them the brooch that the mermaid left behind. And she said, you know, this is a brooch from a mermaid because it's covered with barnacles. And how else could it be covered with barnacles if it hadn't have been in the possession of a mermaid? So one of my favorite questions to the people that visit the town and to whom I tell that story, one of the questions I ask them is, I'm just real curious where you think a mermaid could put a brooch.
Good point. I guess they were fashionably dressed mermaids. I don't know. That's a little different from what we mostly think of. So we could talk more about Crazy Judson or Crazy Feed, but let me ask you, is there anything else that stands out for you in the history of the lighthouse, the human history, or anything else that stands
Yeah,
out that we
just a
haven't mentioned
second.
already?
There was a tin can that Theodore found in 1911 that had washed up on his beach, and he opened it up. And inside, what he found was a scrap of paper. He found it in 1911, but he found a scrap of an old paper bag, and on it the following was written: "Ship Mary S. Crane, London to River Platte, wrecked off Hatteras, February 2nd, 1901, 10 years before. Have been on raft 10 days. Last bit ate and drank. Please tell mother, James P. O'Reilly, North 22nd Catherine Street, Montreal, Canada." And when Theodore opened that can and saw that, he wrote a letter to his mother, which she thanked him for, because she, of course, knew her son was probably dead, but that was the confirmation, and she was very appreciative of him doing that. He was a good guy in many, many ways, but
Yeah.
I found that interesting. The other one was one of the first big murders in town happened in at Stratford Point before the lighthouse was built. One of the men who built the very first house out there in 1785 killed his wife's slave, and it created a big furor in town. He killed her with a pitchfork. I don't know why, but it got a lot of talk in town. However, nothing was ever done about it. So that's another one of the stories from Stratford Point. There are many of them from the founding of Stratford. There were many stories about the point before the lighthouse was ever put there.
So, kind of going up to the more modern history of the lighthouse. I know for years after the light was automated, the Coast Guard was still using the house as like a residence for Coast Guard families. I know I visited during that period. Is anyone living in the keeper's house these days?
Just me.
Just you.
And
Okay.
I don't actually live there. I'm about the only one that goes out there with any
Okay.
regularity, so I use it. But
Okay.
no one lives there. The last keeper moved out 5 years ago. The mayor of Stratford negotiated a lease with the Coast Guard for the lighthouse property that expires in June. She's been trying very hard. She's been working with our local state representative in lordship to have the property turned over to the town of Stratford. I'm not sure where she's at with those negotiations, but people in town are very, very hopeful that she'll be able to acquire that property. They don't want it to be turned into condominiums or anything else. They want it to stay as a permanent historical marker for the town. So she's trying hard. She's been working on it for a long time. And as I say, I'm not sure where the negotiations are at, but the intent is to have the town own it, and ultimately we'll try and make it into a museum so it's more accessible to people more of the time than it is now.
Well, I hope that happens. So I first visited there, I'm going to say, probably late 80s, maybe early 90s, and there was a Coast Guard family living there. The grounds were open, the gate was open, but the tower and house weren't open for the public. I think there was a sign actually where you would park that said, "You're welcome to walk around the grounds, but please check in with the people living in the house." And I remember doing that one time, probably my first visit. But then, and I put on my website in the later 90s something about that, and a guy he was a Coast Guard officer who was living there. He called me and said, "Take that off your website. I don't want people on the grounds." And I guess they closed the gate and they took that sign away. I don't know if you remember all that back then. But anyway, since then, I think ordinarily the public wasn't allowed to go past the gate. We'll talk about tours in a minute, but if people come there at a time when there's not tours going on, can they go past the gate, or is there a good way for them to get photos of the lighthouse?
Well, the there are three different ways you can get photos of the lighthouse. You're not going to be able to go on the grounds unless we're there with a tour.
Yeah.
The gates are always locked, but you can go next door to what is today, it used to be the Remington Gun Club, but today it's the Connecticut Audubon Society owns that property today. And you can get pictures from there, although you'll have a fence blocking a perfect view of the lighthouse. So it's just a chain link fence, so you can see through it, but it's problematic. So you can take pictures from the driveway. That's not a problem. And you can find your way, if you want to brave some rocks, to the shoreline of the lighthouse and take photos from there.
Yeah.
But until part of the reason the grounds are locked up is because the town really doesn't want the liability of having people wander around and get hurt somehow. So that's why the grounds are locked. And I don't think it'll ever be open when there isn't someone there to kind of supervise what's going on.
Has there been any talk of if and when the town gets ownership of having a caretaker live there, something like that?
If there's been that talk, I'm not aware of it, Jeremy. That would be something that the mayor and the town council would have to work on. But I know the mayor's plans primarily now are to make it an event venue like Booth Park is, where you could schedule weddings or outings of one kind or another. But right now, all those conversations are very tentative, and they're based on the ultimate disposition of the lighthouse.
I was looking at the town website, and there's a page for the lighthouse, and I believe there are some tours planned for this coming season.
We have 8 scheduled right now, and they're all on weekends in May and June. I really don't do much down there except in May and June, and then again in September and October, because people all, of course, want to go in the lighthouse, and it's very, very hot inside. Yeah. And not only that, but as you know from having visited, the spiral staircase from the first to the second floor is very easy to get up if you're not mobility impaired somehow. There's about 30, I forget, there's probably 35 stairs to get from the first floor to the second floor. They're not particularly hard, but it's a lot of stairs for someone who has trouble with stairs. But from the second floor to the light level, the third level of the lighthouse, there's a ladder, and that's the same ladder that's been there, I'm sure, since the lighthouse was constructed, and it has about 11 rungs in it. It's tricky, and I always caution people going up. Anybody that decides to make the climb to the lighthouse, we have them sign a a waiver indicating that if they fall or get hurt in some way, that we're not assuming any liability for that. But that's partly why the lighthouse isn't open either, because we want to make sure that there's someone there when people are going up and down the stairway. So what I do is I start with a slide presentation in the keeper's cottage. We let people walk through that. I explain how it was used in 1919. I act the part of Theodore Judson as he was. I have basically his costume, the lighthouse keeper's cap, as much of his costume as I could reconstruct. He was pretty liberal with how he interpreted the costume because no one was around really to report him. So he didn't always stay in the regulation lighthouse keeper's outfit, but I try and do his regulation costume as much as possible. I enact it from the year 1919 because he submitted his resignation as lighthouse keeper, and President Wilson was ill. So he never got around to releasing Theodore, and I just stopped the clock in 1919 and say Theodore is still waiting to be retired from the U.S. Lighthouse Service, and everything here is that we're going to talk about is up to 1919. I also do walking tours in the town as the character of Theodore Judson, and he explains to people that he's doing the tours because he doesn't have to do the lighthouse anymore, but they'll just have to understand that his understanding of the town comes from 1919, and he hasn't done a lot of updating since, but he has firsthand knowledge of who lived where and how old the houses are.
Uh-huh. Well, that's great. You know, you've got the classic white beard that a lot of, I'd say most lighthouse keepers, late 1800s, early 1900s, had white beards. You look at all those photos. I'm not sure about the Judson. I think he had some facial hair, but
He
you've got the
did.
proper beard. Yeah. So I think I saw somewhere that not only Keeper Judson makes appearances at these open houses, but his wife as well. Is that right?
Kate, he was married to for many, many years. He was a plumber in town before he became the lighthouse keeper in 1880. And so my wife helps me out there. She reenacts the role of Kate Judson as his wife and tells her story. A fascinating woman. Her father was a French immigrant. Her maiden name was Dufour. She raised four children in that home. And most of the time, she educated them at home because it was impossible for them to get into town. But when the weather was good, she would send the children into town, into the center of Stratford, to go to center school. And when the kids came home, she complained to the town that she always hated when the kids would return from being educated in the town because she found that they regressed. They didn't, she'd done such a good job of training them, and the town always messed them up when they'd go in to go to school there. So she wanted them to be socialized. She wanted them to have contact with other young people. She just didn't feel like the instructors were providing the kind of education that she was. She was a school teacher herself before her marriage. So we talk a lot about Kate. She was witness, as I mentioned, to some of Theodore's mermaid stories, and I'm sure, although I've never confirmed that she probably saw the sea monster as well. I don't see how she couldn't have.
Can't miss it. Yeah. You know, it just popped into my head just to throw this in about probably at least 15 years ago. I'm very involved with the local lighthouse here, Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse, New Hampshire. And I founded the group that takes care of it. And I was interviewed by a young woman reporter from the Portsmouth Herald probably 15 or so years ago. And she had the idea that I was a lighthouse keeper who actually lived there full time. And one of the questions she asked me was, "Do you ever get so lonely at the lighthouse you see mermaids?" Or the rocks. I don't know. Maybe she had read about the Judson. I don't know, but
I don't know, but when you're lonely, the mermaids can help alleviate that.
I would think so. I would think
One
so.
of Kate's problems with the mermaids visiting is they were very afraid that they would sing their siren song, and Theodore would be called out and lose his life on the rocks just to the south of Stratford Point. So
Yeah.
she wasn't worried about what kind of trouble he would get into with the mermaids from any kind of in any kind of sexual way. She was mainly worried that they would lead him into the water and he would subsequently drown. So she
Right.
was aware of their presence and tried
Yeah.
to do her best to guard him from them.
Yeah.
When incidentally, the mermaids left and they've never been seen again because Agnes, who was a little social butterfly, went to visit her girlfriends in um, Massachusetts when she was in or not Massachusetts, I'm sorry. She went to New Jersey to visit her girlfriends. And they said, I don't know what we're doing in New Jersey. You live on a lighthouse property. It's beautiful out there. We would really enjoy going there. So she said, well, why don't we go back to Stratford? They did. And when the mermaids saw the girls from New Jersey, the girls were so beautiful that they told Thane they weren't going to stick around anymore because those Jersey girls had shown them up with their beauty, and after the Jersey girls appeared at Stratford Point, the mermaids left, never to be seen again. So if you want to know why you don't see mermaids at Stratford Point today, it's because of the Jersey girls.
Well, and that's another story I never heard before. Wow. Let me ask you so the town doesn't own the property, at least not yet, but has the town been involved in maintenance type painting or anything like that in recent years?
The Coast Guard painted the lighthouse about a year ago now.
Hmm.
They also did what remediation of lead has occurred inside the lighthouse. So before they really didn't want people in there because of the lead, but we can actually take people in now. There are still signs posted everywhere
Hmm.
indicating that they need to be careful and
Not eat it.
not touch anything and so forth and so on. But largely it's okay to be in there for a short period of time and to go up to the top, and we wouldn't want to endanger people by having them if that were the case. The grounds themselves are maintained by the town, and the interior of the cottage is maintained by the town. But the work on the outside of the cottage and also the lighthouse itself, that's still being done by the Coast Guard.
Yeah. It's kind of a partnership, really. The 400th anniversary of Stratford is coming up a few years from now, like 2039. Is that right? It'll be the 400th anniversary.
2039.
Yeah. I saw there's a Facebook page for Stratford 400. So is planning already underway for that?
We're trying. We've been working on it now really since 2014. So
Hmm.
when 2014 happened, which was our 375th anniversary, I created a Facebook page called Stratford 375. In 2015, after that anniversary year was over, I renamed the page to Stratford 400 in preparation for Stratford's 400th anniversary. So we've been doing a little bit of fundraising. We'll do more over time, but we're in the middle of a project right now. We're participating with the state on the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Stratford was actually very involved in that through a man by the name of William Samuel Johnson, who was Connecticut's first senator. His father founded the Episcopal Church, the oldest Episcopal church in Connecticut, in 1723. He was born in 1723. He was neutral during the war. He was an Episcopalian, but he never was viewed as a Tory. And he just was neutral. And after the war was over, he went to Philadelphia to participate in the Congress as Stratford's representative. He became Stratford's first senator, and people would come to visit him. George Washington, Lafayette, Ben Franklin. There were many different members of the founding fathers who would come to town to visit with William Samuel Johnson and his father. William's father, Samuel, founded Columbia University. It was originally called King's College. And after the war, William Samuel Johnson was appointed the head of Columbia College at the time. He was the first president of Columbia College. So at Columbia University usually comes to town every few years to make sure his gravesite is maintained and looking well. They've done a real nice job of that over the years.
Yeah.
And he's really a very famous, not unknown founding father. But because of our connection to that, we're doing quite a bit with the 250th observation of the Declaration of Independence. And we're hoping that that will just continue as we continue raising money. We're hoping that that'll just play into the 400th, and we can use what we're doing now for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence as part of our 400th celebration in 2039.
That's all great stuff. So I have two final questions for you for bonus points, okay? So sharpen your number 2 pencil. Okay, the first bonus point question is, what do you think Stratford Point Lighthouse means to the people of Stratford?
There are a lot of people that know the lighthouse is there. I don't always know how many of them have visited because they know when they go. Well, first of all, the road that it's on is very narrow. The people that live in that part of town are very wealthy, and they do not appreciate people parking all over the road, blocking their way, make it impossible for them to get out. And so they aren't always extremely friendly to visitors. And really, without the gates open to the grounds, there isn't a good place to park. So you have to park over on Connecticut Audubon's property and then walk down this narrow road to get back to the lighthouse. So they know it's there. They're passionate about it being protected. They all want to visit, but right now, because we're using our tours as a way to fund our 250th celebration of the Declaration, not everyone wants to actually pay to tour the lighthouse. They really just want it open so that they can go to it whenever they want. And to me, it doesn't serve the town well to ever do that because you miss out on the history, you miss out on, to me, why anybody would want to visit that lighthouse. And I know if I go to Stonington, Connecticut, or other places where they've opened up their lighthouses, they've done it as part of a museum setup. And I think ours ought to be that as well. What my objective is long term is the Stratford Historical Society has literally hundreds of amazing paintings. Some of the finest artists in America painted in Stratford at one point or another. And they have many of their paintings that sit in a storage room and nobody ever sees. And I'd really like to rotate, I'd really like to turn the cottage into an art space where we could display some of that artwork. And then also have a little gift shop area and have it be a place where we charge some kind of minimal fee before you learn more about the lighthouse and then actually go up into it. Obviously, the lighthouse doesn't change. If you've been there once, you may never want to go back again, but if it were open all the time, I get, when the lighthouse is open, I get visitors. I've had visitors there from Idaho who, for some reason, are visiting Connecticut and they want to tour the lighthouse. So I know whenever I'm out there, there's usually somebody that will stop and ask me, can I go in the lighthouse? Can I take a tour? And I think that would be what it would mean to people, would actually be not only a museum, but an economic development opportunity.
Well, I'd love to see a museum there. And, with lighthouses, I always think if you open them, they will come. The people will come from all over. And as you've seen, there are people who are fanatical about visiting as many lighthouses as they can. I have one final question for you for extra bonus points. Okay, and that question is, what is your favorite thing about being the Stratford town historian?
My very most favorite thing is telling Stratford people about their history. They live there. Many of them grow up their whole life there, and many of them have done precious little in town. So I get a real good turnout for the walks that I do just because I can't even tell you how many times people on my walks will say, why don't we know this? Why isn't this taught in school? Why do I have to come on your walk to find out about our history? And I don't really have a good answer for that. It's unfortunate. I've tried for years to somehow spark development in economic development by having people learn about our history, or by having them learn about our birding in town. We have amazing birding areas in town, and we get birders from all over America who will fly in to chase birds around Stratford. And precious few of the people in town even know any of that. So my favorite part is just telling people about their history, and it's fascinating.
Well, obviously, you're a great ambassador for the town. I was thinking you are also a great storyteller, kind of in a sense in the tradition of Theodore Judson, except that your stories are true. So you're not
As
quite
much as I can make them.
right. Well, I don't think he bothered with any attempt to tell the truth, but he told great stories, and so do you. So, David Wright, thank you so much for your time today. This is great. Anybody listening who might not know much about Stratford knows something about it now. There's obviously a lot more, but what a fascinating place. So many interesting connections to parts of American history. And the lighthouse itself has a lot of great stories, obviously, too. So good luck with the lighthouse tours, the open houses this season, and with the town's future relationship with the lighthouse there. I'll look forward to following that. But again, thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Jeremy. I've enjoyed our time.
As I said in the interview, I first visited Stratford Point back in the late 1980s. I remember, I think it was the first time I visited there when the Coast Guardsman who lived in the Keeper's house was painting the tower. It's a lighthouse you don't hear a lot about, but it's a beautiful spot, and the town and the light station have some fascinating history. Of course, a lot of the light station history revolves around Keeper Theodore Judson, a.k.a. Crazy Theod or Crazy Judson, and his tall tales. If you want to meet Keeper Judson via David Wright's portrayal, you can attend one of the open houses at Stratford Point Lighthouse. The upcoming dates are May 17th and 18th, and June 7th, 8th, 21st, and 22nd. They all start at 1 p.m. For more info, go to the Stratford Town website at stratfordct.gov and look under the Community Event Calendar. I hope you're all enjoying the spring and looking forward to a fun summer visiting lighthouses. A reminder to visit uslhs.org to learn about all the things the U.S. Lighthouse Society offers, including preservation grants, tours, and the passport program. Also, I wanted to mention an event that's coming up in just a couple of days. This episode is being posted on Sunday, May 4th. On Tuesday, May 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, I'll be hosting a special U.S. Lighthouse Society virtual presentation. The focus will be the famous 1952 Coast Guard rescue off Cape Cod that was the basis for the book and movie The Finest Hours. The boat that was used in that rescue, the motor lifeboat CG 36500, is owned by the Orleans Historical Society, and in the virtual event, representatives of the society will tell about their plans for a new museum to display the boat. The event is free to attend, but you need to register in advance. Go to uslhs.org and look under events. We will be back with an episode of Lighthearted Light next Sunday and a new full episode in 2 weeks. For now, to all our regular listeners and our new ones, thanks so much for listening, and keep a good light.
Let it shine, let it shine.